4 days later, the British army arrived at Seringapatam, and upon their arrival, they settled in while Tipu readied his defenses. The defenses consisted of primarily cannons mounted on the city walls, and Tipu had approximately 30,000 troops within the walls. The British Army and the Indian forces employed by the East India Company numbered 50,000 in total, and they had many field pieces and siege cannons. While scouting the area around the city, Sharpe and Lawford examined a stack of rockets on the city wall. Lawford explained that the rockets could be deadly but had little accuracy. As they watched, the rockets were used, but at that range, they did little more than turn heads and cause horsemen to take minor evasive action. The effect was more psychological than physical, with all the sputtering, flaming, and erratic courses. Sharpe commented that Tipu had thousands of rockets that, if they were all to go off at once, would cause a great deal of panic and damage. The British Army set up camp to the south of the city, and Goodine gave Sharpe and Lawford rifles with orders to shoot 2 British officers. Sharpe missed his target by 6 inches, but Lawford, who had experience with hunting guns, took down his target. Despite feeling remorse for this action against his own army, Lawford kept it hidden from Goodine. Sharpe then took Lawford to a tavern in an attempt to raise his spirits, and they talked about Hakeswell's scheme to sell Mary into adultery and the characters of other officers with whom they had had trouble. Lawford began to admire Sharpe's easy way with the harshness of the world. Meanwhile, the British Army and Indian forces continued to make preparations to breach the city walls and engage in battle. Mary worked in General Apparao's house, where she was responsible for teaching English to the 3 children. Lakshmi, Rao's wife, took a liking to Mary and even showed her how to wear an elegant sari properly. During a conversation with Lakshmi, Mary told her that Sharpe was her half-brother. Lakshmi began to consider Mary as a potential wife for Cornwell, who was a relative of hers. During the siege on the west wall of the city, the British aimed to destroy most of Tipu's army between the inner and outer city walls by setting off a massive black powder mine. They attempted to drive Tipu's troops out of a stand of trees at night, but the battle quickly turned chaotic. Sergeant Hakeswell became separated from his company and resorted to hiding. In a twisted mind, he murdered one of the ensigns who he believed had insulted him earlier, and claimed that the blood on his halberd was from the enemy. However, the ensign had not intended to insult Hakeswell in any way. Goodine ordered Sharpe to ride a horse towards the British fighters in the woods and issue confusing commands to them. Sharpe tried, but he did not receive an answer until he called out Hakeswell's name. Sharpe headed into the woods towards Hakeswell, and a fight broke out between them. A squad of British soldiers arrived, but a volley of musket fire chased them away. Sharpe had hoped to slip through to the British command and warn them not to attack the west wall, but the fight delayed him long enough to kill his plan. Hakeswell was taken prisoner, and everyone returned to the city. Tipu had his jetties execute criminals, after which he honored the brave soldiers on his side. Sharpe received a large gold medallion for his fight with Hakeswell, which attracted the British squad that was subsequently captured. After the ceremony, Sharpe left to visit Mary at Rose's house, where he learned that Mary wanted to marry Cornwell. Sharpe accepted this as fair because he knew that Mary was just trying to survive as best she could. He then came upon the gate where Tipu's men were packing in a great deal of black powder for the mine. He managed to gain access and saw how the mine would destroy many British soldiers when set off. The British officers discussed the battle plans and were confident that the outer wall would be breached. They believed that the initial assault forces, called Forlorn Hopes, would be able to gain entry into the city. Despite the low chances of survival for the Forlorn Hopes, there were always volunteers. While the officers discussed strategy, the army dug a zigzag network of trenches. Tipu's troops used a mill fort as cover to fire cannons effectively against the British position. The British mounted an attack and successfully took the fort. They then brought their own siege cannons into the fort. Tipu entertained his troops with dancers, jugglers, snake charmers, and strongman tricks from the jettis. He then brought in the British prisoners, including Hakeswell, and ordered the jettis to kill all of them. Hakeswell dodged and ducked while spewing his usual lines, but when he claimed to have seen a British officer in the city, Tipu halted the execution. Hakeswell gave the name of the British officer, Lawford, and identified Sharpe as a British private to save his own life while getting Sharpe into trouble. Sharpe and Lawford discussed Mary's decision to marry an enemy and whether they were in jeopardy of being discovered. Colonel Goodine arrived to arrest them, but he did so reluctantly because he had grown to like Sharp. Regardless, the two had been found out and were now Tipu's prisoners. General Aparayo questioned Mary about her knowledge of what Lawford and Sharp were up to, and she denied knowing anything. He then gave her a loaded pistol to use in case she needed to do the unthinkable and save herself from brutal soldiers. After questioning Lawford and Sharp, Tipu decided to put them in the dungeon with McCandless and Hakeswill rather than feeding them to the tigers. Sharp discovered an old tiger in one of the cells of the dungeon, and he found out that Hakeswill occupied the cell next to the animal. Sharp and Lawford shared McCandless' cell, and they had a conversation about the British situation. They talked about how the situation was bad because Tipu's black powder mine was almost finished, and the attack was going to be directed straight into it. McCandless decided to teach Sharp how to read and write. In the meantime, Tipu was watching the British as they prepared for the attack. He hoped that an early monsoon rainstorm would stop the attempt, but unfortunately, it did not happen. The British opened fire with 4 batteries of cannons and targeted the walls to either side of where they planned to breach the city. This strategy was implemented to eliminate any enemy cannons that could fire into the flanks of the soldiers. After this step was completed, all the British cannons focused on the area where the outer wall had to be opened before the troops could attack and take the city. As the time approached for the breach, the British troops filed into the network of trenches and got ready for the attack. Aparayo had sent 6 of his men to retrieve McCandless from the dungeon and take him to Rayo's house, where he could be relatively safe. When Mary arrived, she demanded to go with the men to rescue her supposed half-brother, Sharp. Kunwar Singh objected, but Mary insisted and took the loaded pistol with her. Singh reluctantly went along. When the rescuers arrived at the dungeon, they found the outer gate locked and unguarded. The tiger had been released and was preventing the prisoners from escaping. Sharp asked Mary for a gun and she threw the loaded pistol down the stairs, but it got stuck. Sharp managed to pick the lock and get the gun, but the tiger attacked. Sharp shot the tiger, killing it, and the prisoners, except for Hakeswill, were able to escape. Lawford took McCandless away while Sharp stayed behind to fight the Jettis. Mary gave Sharp a loaded musket which he used to defend himself. Sharp took a sword and used it to finish off the 2 Jettis. Following this, while the British were preparing to launch an attack through the breach, Sharp and Lawford attempted to locate the black powder mine and disarm it in some way. During their search, they stumbled upon a cart full of rockets and decided to take it with them. However, as they finally located the black powder mine, the British attack began, creating an obstacle for Sharp. He realized that he couldn't just approach the mine since it was being guarded by several men. Therefore, he lit the fuses of the rockets and pushed the cart towards the guards. As the rockets exploded, Sharp took cover. Once the last rocket was launched, he checked the impact, finding that all the guards were either dead or running away. After this, he quickly lit the fuse of the black powder mine, hoping to set it off before the British reached the breach. The black powder mine blast was designed to direct the force between the inner and outer city walls. However, there were no British soldiers that had made it that far, and the damage was mostly inflicted on Tipu's troops stationed around and atop the inner wall. The walls suffered damage as well, with some parts toppling and the stones and bricks becoming loose. To avoid the blast, Sharp took refuge in a doorway. Following the mine blast, the forlorn hopes charged into the city and were able to easily slaughter the stunned enemy, who were unable to offer any resistance. The rest of the British army followed suit, and enemy reinforcements rushed toward the breached city walls. However, the battle shifted when Tipu's men regained their senses and began firing from cover into the amassed British forces. The British forces took cover wherever possible and returned fire. In the midst of the chaos, Sharp gathered 3 abandoned muskets and loaded them. He then found Lawford and Goudain, and the latter commented to Lawford that Sharp had the potential to go far in the British army. Sharp then headed out to deal with Hakeswill, who was still imprisoned. Sharp managed to shoot the lock off Hakeswill's cell and dragged him into the street, then into the courtyard where the tigers were chained. Without hesitation, Sharp threw Hakeswill to the tigers. Tipu, realizing that the battle was hopeless, attempted to escape. He shot musket after musket into the British forces while his aides reloaded and handed him more guns. Tipu tried to make his way to a water gate away from the fighting, hoping to escape on horseback to one of his other cities. However, the British cut him off just outside the city walls. Sharp followed Tipu through the water gate, and a guard closed the door behind him, cutting him off from the city. Tipu's aides fought the British, but were all killed. Tipu attempted to escape into the city, but Sharpe stood in his way. They engaged in a fight, and Sharpe managed to fatally wound Tipu. The following day, Sharpe watched as Tipu's casket was brought to his family's mausoleum. Fresh sergeant stripes were sewn onto Sharpe's coat, elevating him to the same rank as Hakeswill, who had somehow managed to escape the Tigers. Sharpe told McCandless that he would deal with Hakeswill later. This is the end of the book. If you liked what you heard, please press like, leave a comment, and subscribe. If you didn't like what you heard, thank you for watching this long. See you soon on Books Recapped.